Kia ora koutou, ngā mihi o tērā. Ko waio, ko Springbok te maunga, ko Narangta Awa, no Aotearoa toku whānau, no Madra Australia ahau, ko Richards me Pearson toku whānau, ko Fee Buzz toku wahine, ko Rupert Ralph Luke toku tamariki, he's just up there, and ko Justin toku whenua. Ko hau te academic lead mo ihi Aotearoa, ko hau hoki te ahunuku kori te nana me hauora mō te renga waka. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Thank you, Hannah, and thanks for the welcome today to speak here. My family's originally from New Zealand, Aotearoa, New Zealand. In fact, the Richards hail from the South Island. My father was born in Hokitika, brought up in Invercargill, and the Richards are represented here today. My uncle, thanks for being here, Mark. He's based here in Canterbury, so there's a strong Canterbury connection. But my parents moved to Australia 44 years ago for a year, and they're still there. So I was brought up in a place called Madrabar on the Gold Coast in Australia. Madrabar means place of sticky dirt in the language of the Yagamba people, the local custodians of the land, which I was brought up. That sticky dirt got all over my clothes when I was out being physically active as a kid. My mum will tell you all about that. If she was here, she would be nodding her head right now. But I got the opportunity to come back to New Zealand and work at Sport New Zealand. Almost 7 years to the day, actually. It was last week. It was a 7-year anniversary. And work at Sport New Zealand, the policy agency responsible for promoting physical activity in this country. And so I hold a post now. It's a dual post, as Hannah said, between Sport New Zealand and Victoria University, which sounds like a dream job, but it's a hell of a lot of hard work. But actually the third job I have, and it's the most important job, is to be a good partner to Fee and a dad to Rupert, who is the noisy one out the back there that you can hear running around. It's the first time I've ever presented in front of those two, and also in front of my uncle, so I'm a little bit more nervous about that than anything else today. That's onto you. Well, while we're getting this sorted out, though, let's just do a little bit of audience engagement. If I was to say to you, physical activity and mental health, if I was to say, is physical activity good for mental health? Hands up if you say yes. Yep. Anyone putting their hands up for no? There's a no. There was a little here. So there's maybe something else going on here. But resoundingly, we live by this blanket statement that physical activity is good for mental health. In fact, there's been huge amounts of investment, huge amounts of intervention that's gone into this, that's hidden by this blanket statement that physical activity is good for mental health. And today I just want to dig into that a little bit further. Going right back, and I heard in the introduction that there's a lot of people presenting for the first time from their PhDs and the work they're doing, going right back to where I started in my PhD work and working through a bunch of research projects that have happened since then. So let's go back to that PhD and let's look at some of the data that I first found when I started looking into this space here. And let's imagine that we're evaluating a 10-week community sport program. Now the context is really important, but we're going to come to that. So let's just imagine a 10-week community sport program funded based on the basis of this blanket statement that physical activity is good for mental health. In its simplest form, it was an organised football league run in a community for 11 to 14-year-olds where one group was exposed to this program and one group wasn't, a comparison group. Based on the responses we saw before, if we think about what will be the impact on mental health of this particular program, it would be fair to say we would expect some sort of positive change in group 1 and no change in group 2. Although I suspect there's some people who are already starting to think about this in a slightly different way. This is the headline result from my entire PhD, one graph. This is the scores around mental health. Zoomed in to the scores there. And the important things here, group 1 was the group that was exposed to the intervention. Group 2 was the group that was the comparison group. A higher score is a worse score. when it comes to mental health. We'd been doing all this work under the assumption that physical activity was good for mental health, and I popped along and found this finding when we actually did a 10-week program, and we found that actually relative to a comparison group, a group exposed to this particular program got worse when we're looking at their mental health outcomes. Seemed like a very strange result. Now the important thing here is the context, because we had to go back and look at this. This doesn't fit with our rhetoric, this doesn't fit with the existing evidence that we've got. What's going on here? So let's have a look at a little bit more context, and we'll go deeper on this. This was a particularly vulnerable and marginalised group of children. In fact, you probably couldn't find a group affected by high levels of inequity anywhere in the world. More on that in a minute. Where they were, there was no infrastructure or resources for sport and recreational physical activity. And also, there was really limited local knowledge about coordinating sport and recreational physical activities. So, this intervention was an organised football league, but in order for it to happen, we had to build infrastructure in the town for that to happen. We had to provide football equipment for this to occur, and we had to empower and train up football coaches so that they could actually support the program to happen. And of course, both groups were all exposed to that. So this isn't our perfect little RCT. We never have those in behavioural science, do we? But we actually had a situation where we had two groups exposed to a hell of a lot of more things than just the organised football league. In fact, when we looked at their physical fitness as a proxy for their physical activity, we saw both of them improved. So both of them have been more physically active. Both groups have actually got improvements in their physical fitness. Yet, we still have this result where the group exposed to our intervention as such, the organised football league, went backwards relative to the other group. What explains this result? Let's go deeper on the context. This took place in northern Uganda on the back of 20 years of civil war that was characterised by high levels of child abduction. 1 in 3 boys were abducted. High levels of child soldier, so these boys were made into soldiers. And high levels of internal displacement. So these kids were actually not living in their homes, not living with their families, and they'd been displaced and living somewhere else. So when we think about this reference point for contest, these two teams of kids here, who are 13 and 14, their previous reference point for contest was war, literally fighting against each other. And then we threw them into a competitive football league. If we look at the reference point for coaching, this war had been going for 20 years. So most of the coaches that we'd trained up, they were also former child soldiers, people who'd been exposed to this war for an extended period of time. They also had only reference point in terms of coaching was what they saw on the 2 or 3 TVs that existed in the town when Arsenal played Liverpool, and the coaches pranced around the box and yelled at the players and waved their arms around and took them off when they didn't do any good. So that was their reference point for coaching. Now, we put a lot of training into that to try and change that, but it was still a persistent reference point for how they saw they would coach a football team. In an environment where it was very unusual to ever publicly berate anyone, where you would never yell at anyone, and this was happening. And in an environment where these young boys, who'd never been exposed to any football opportunities prior to now, saw Drogba playing for Chelsea, because that was the timing that was there, and the opportunity and this idea that this could be their one and only opportunity to break out of where they were. They had a huge amount of their self-concept and their self-worth wrapped up in how they were going to go in this competitive football league. Now, it's an extreme example. So you say, well, how is this relevant to Aotearoa, New Zealand? How is this relevant to the Canterbury region here? Now, the truth is that sometimes we need to look at extreme examples and see extreme results to see things that might be happening right under our noses that are covered up by blankets that we don't actually see, perhaps at a lower level. And some of the research that I'll present from here on today, I think will build that case that we're seeing something similar at a lower level in other contexts in less extreme environments. It's also easy to point the finger and to say it's competitive sport that's the issue. It's sport that's the issue. It's broader physical activity is okay. But actually, it's everything that's going on around that sport that was the problem here. And we've done a bunch of research, and I believe some of this is going to be presented later today as well. But some of the work that we've done actually more recently is just some work here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We looked at 6,800 young people with a representative sample from our Active NZ survey, a cross-sectional survey, and we looked at what's the association between participation in sport and mental well-being. And what we found was that those who were participating in sport had a 66% higher odds of having good well-being than those who weren't. And that was after we adjusted, of course, for the usual suspects, our socio-demographic factors, and also any other physical activity that they might be participating in. Now, cross-sectional, is one causing the other? Is the participation in sport causing the better mental well-being outcomes, or is the better mental well-being causing participation in sport? But what was really clear, we'll come to that, but what was really clear was that actually there were components of this participation in sport that were important. The quality of the coaching and the social interaction seemed to be important mediating factors that actually made this relationship stronger or weaker if it wasn't there. So something around the delivery, which is important when we're looking at the relationship between physical activity and mental health outcomes. So as I said, cross-sectional. But we do have some data, and this is some work that I did previously in Tonga. And we looked at 324 people across 14 villages attached to this program, the Kao Mai Tonga program. Massive program, huge health promotion program that was really based around promoting netball and the use of netball for health outcomes. This was some form of natural experiment, and it was being rolled out across the country, but we were able to actually pick up indicators of where this was well implemented or not so well implemented. So poor implementation versus good implementation in each of these 14 villages. And what we found was that actually, regardless of the implementation level, based on the indicators that we collected, the participation in netball went up quite significantly. And also there was huge changes, massive changes in actual recreational physical activity minutes per week. But both of those were pretty similar to each other. But when we actually looked at the mental well-being changes that occurred in those same groups, they were quite different to each other. Yes, we saw improvements in both, but there were bigger improvements in those where the program was implemented well. Again, something to do with the delivery, which is really important in the association between physical activity and mental health. So the first take-home message or key message today, physical activity is only part of the greater social phenomenon that surrounds it when considering mental well-being outcomes. The quality of this experience for the participants is absolutely key. It's a key factor when we're looking underneath that blanket that's linking physical activity and mental health. So what? Why is this important? It's not intended that you can read this. This is a cutout page from the latest World Health Organization recommendations for physical activity for 5 to 17-year-olds. This review was done and these were updated in 2020, 2021. An extensive process, global experts brought in, and the recommendations were updated. A couple of key things: at least 60 minutes a day of moderate to vigorous physical activity, things that might seem familiar to us, at least on 3 days a week doing vigorous intensity activity, which is good for our strengthening bones and muscles. At the last minute, the very last minute, and I can tell you about the conversation that happened that made it happen, we got this little bit in to the good practice statements. It's important to provide all children and adolescents with safe and equitable opportunities and encouragement to participate in physical activities that are enjoyable, offer variety, and appropriate for age and ability. The recommendations around moderate to vigorous physical activity are really driven by cardiovascular outcomes and metabolic outcomes. When it comes to mental health, there are other factors that are actually really important that we take into account. Now, we got this in as one word on this page, hidden in the good practice statements. We're really hoping when we actually review these again in 6 or 7 years from now that actually it comes up as a recommendation or it features more in the recommendations itself. So if I come back to this question and I put the word always in, is physical activity always good for mental health? The answer is clearly that there's some nuance here and that we need to be aware of this nuance when we're thinking about how we deliver and how we think about physical activity and its promotion in our communities if we want to optimise that mental health outcome. And this really challenges our assumption that doing something is better than nothing. I guarantee, even for the most die-hard physical activity people in this room, Nick Draper's one of them, Skate's another, that I could find a physical activity that would be great for their mental well-being, but I could also find something that if I subjected them to that physical activity would probably have a negative effect on their mental well-being. So there's something around this nuance and there's something that's important that we actually need to take into account when we think about something, that something is not always better than nothing. So that really prompted me, and this was back in 2015, to think about, well, what mechanisms are linking physical activity and mental health? We've got this blanket statement. We've actually got reasonably compelling evidence, but now we're starting to get some evidence that actually there's something more going on here. And I worked with a bunch of people in Australia and in the US, and we actually reviewed the existing evidence. And what we did is we came up with these mechanistic pathways. These were the 3 that we came up with at the time. We thought, well, there's this neurobiological pathway. When I move my arms and legs like this, somehow I rearrange the hardware, the neurons and the software, the neurotransmitters in a way in my brain, which means that I have these mental health changes. This psychosocial pathway mechanism that, well, it's everything that's going on around the activity itself that's somehow affecting whether or not the mental health outcome occurs in the way I want it to. Or the behavioural outcome, the behaviour of physical activity affects other behaviours, how well I sleep, which will also affect, what happens with my mental health, as well as other behavioural characteristics, auto-regulation, self-regulation that I might develop through being physically active and those skills that occur. So we had this information that linked us to the mechanisms. We had information that linked these mechanisms to mental health. And we went about doing a review to say, well, what studies, what papers have actually done something where they've got data around physical activity, these mechanisms, as we define them at the time, and some sort of mental health outcome. And we came up with this framework, which is just a more complicated version of what I presented on the previous slide. You've got physical activity on the left, you've got our mechanisms, neurobiological, psychosocial, and behavioural in the middle, and then we've got all the different mental health outcomes that we considered along the way. Cognitive function, well-being outcomes such as resilience and global self-esteem, and ill-being outcomes, anxiety, depression, and other externalising disorders. And we looked at the literature to see what's there. And what became abundantly clear was the importance of getting the psychosocial components right in terms of achieving multiple of these mental health outcomes. There's also a lot of work to be done in this space too. We found very limited evidence around what we called the behavioural hypothesis. Now, important, limited evidence is not lack of effect. This is a clear sign that we needed to do more work and more research in this space. And we found some really mixed results when it came to the neurobiological hypothesis. Really a sign of the complexity. I talked about moving arms and legs and neurotransmitters and neurons and that sort of stuff, but the complexity of what we're talking about in this space and the way these were measured and all the different heterogeneity across the studies gave us a huge amount of mixed results in this space. But probably the most important thing that came out of this particular work from me was this new thought. Do these different mechanisms somehow work together? Or can one override another when we're delivering the same intervention? Or is there some kind of different combination that occurs when we actually put in place an intervention of one mechanism working in a positive way and another mechanism somehow detracting from that? Or this combination, or any combination that we might think of. Or actually combinations within each of the mechanisms themselves. So if we come back then to the original study, and we consider this an earlier case study that we looked at, where we had all these common components of an intervention, and we had this difference in terms of organised football leagues for Group 1 and Group 2. And we think about those pathways. What I think was going on there was this massive psychosocial override. The kids were moving, we knew that. We saw they were more physically fit, they were more physically active. But what was going on around that in the psychosocial mechanism space was so powerful that it overrode any of the other changes that we would have seen in terms of the mental health outcomes. So that brings me to take-home point 2 for today. We want to optimise the mental well-being through quality physical activity opportunities. Think about aligning the neurobiological, psychosocial and behavioural mechanisms when we're doing this. But of course, there may be other mechanisms. This is how we categorise it. This is how we came up with things when we did this work. And what's become abundantly clear to me, particularly in my time since I've been back here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, is that this was a very Western science approach to approaching the problem. We were thinking about things, putting them in boxes. We were actually thinking about things and being somehow reductive in the way we were trying to actually identify what the mechanism was. And discussions with Indigenous and Māori colleagues, Indigenous colleagues from across the world, started me thinking, actually, what other mechanisms, what other things should we be thinking about here that perhaps we're missing? And one of the models and one of the frameworks that has been particularly helpful for me in trying to make sense of some of this is Te Whetū Rehua. Te Whetū Rehua, the guiding star, was a framework established by Hironga Potama, a group of Māori sport and physical activity providers across the country with the support of Sport New Zealand i Aotearoa. Its entire purpose is to guide the development of physical activity interventions in an as Māori space, providing a space for people to be active as Māori. It looks like this. It's a star. It's a 5-point star. And what it has is it has 3 layers to it. And the idea here is that an ideal as Māori intervention, which will bring about the greatest well-being outcomes for the people participating, is if you can be in that inner red star. Let's work through each of the points. So the bottom left corner there, we're talking about, well, is the activity something which is a traditional or a customary physical activity for our people participating? For example, kia rahi, waka ama. Move up a point. Is it being governed? Is it being led? Is it being managed? Is it being delivered by whānau, hapu, iwi, Māori? Is it happening in total immersion in te reo Māori with appropriate tikanga wrapped around it? Over to the top right corner. Is it whānau-centred? And down to the bottom right. Is it happening in an environment which somehow connects culturally with what the activity is? Is it happening in Te Tao, in the natural environment? Is it happening on the marae? Is it happening in the whenua? What's the link with awa? What's the link with maunga? So this created this idea, if we're trying to create a physical activity intervention and we're trying to think about guiding that to be as Māori, to optimise wellbeing outcomes, particularly for Indigenous people, is this somehow transferable, the principles of it, to other contexts, to other Indigenous contexts in the world? And I thought back to my original work in Uganda. And instead of thinking as Māori, I thought, well, what about as Indigenous people of northern Uganda? And I think about the intervention that we rolled out there. And this is where we land in the star, bearing in mind the further you get out from the middle of the star, the further away you get from actually delivering or providing an intervention as Māori or as Indigenous for the people who are participating. So they were playing football, which had no cultural relevance whatsoever to the people there. Some would argue that it was actually only delivered locally. It was actually funded by the UK, Australian and Canadian governments, so it was definitely governed there. Some would say it was managed there as well. There were some people on the ground, so again, I've put us in the second layer of the star there. It was delivered in both Luo, the local language, but hugely in English, so that all the people from the funding bodies outside could understand. It was targeted at 11 to 14-year-olds, so it wasn't across the whānau. It was a particular segment, and it took place on grounds that we created of no cultural significance whatsoever. And when you put these bits together, it starts me thinking, oh, there's something going on here in the context of what was happening in that physical activity that's somehow relevant to the wellbeing outcomes that we might have expected or might have hoped would happen in this particular group. And again, I just want to reiterate that this is taking the principles of a Māori framework and applying it elsewhere in a way which has helped me make sense of previous work that I've done. So, third take-home message here. Western science is not the only way of knowing. Mātauranga Māori applies a holistic approach that is critical for optimising wellbeing, and Indigenous ways of knowing may actually, or will actually, be helpful for us to make sense of some of the things that we are struggling to make sense of, sometimes through Western science. In these discussions and in this time of working closely with Māori and Indigenous colleagues, I started to understand more this idea of a strengths-based approach. Strengths-based approach in terms of community work, strengths-based approach in terms of the research that I might be interested in doing. And what became clear here is that when we look back at this work, there were different pathways that were going on. In fact, we saw different results when we were looking at the carrot versus the stick in terms of mental well-being or mental ill-being outcomes and the role of physical activity in its promotion. And what also became really, really clear is that when we look at those WHO recommendations, remember, 60 minutes a day of moderate to vigorous physical activity or 3 days a week of vigorous activity, we were really focused on frequency, intensity and time as the way we define dose of physical activity, which is important for our health outcomes. But actually, when we listen to our Indigenous colleagues and we look at some of the frameworks that they come up with, this idea of type and context really shines through as an important thing for us to be taking into account when we're looking at mental health outcomes. So I thought, well, what if we changed our focus? A lot of our work has been reasonably deficit-based. We talk about and we think about this in terms of physical activity and our promotion of physical activity to prevent ill-being, to prevent cognitive decline, to prevent depression and anxiety. What if we started thinking about this a little differently and we swung it around? The promotion of physical activity to promote or develop well-being, to promote cognition, to promote well-being in the form of happiness. And I got really interested in this word, happiness, and that happened really quickly. So I did what any good researcher does. I Googled it. What is happiness? And number 4 on our list came up, our good friends, Coca-Cola. And I thought to myself, oh wow. So I had a good look around and, you know, Open Coke, Open Happiness, these guys are doing a lot of this. They've been doing it for a long time. They clearly planned on doing it into the future. And damn it, they seem to have found some way of measuring it, which is something we always challenges for us as researchers, and doing it really cheaply. What are they onto that we're not onto? So I thought, well, who else is involved in this happiness gig? McDonald's, the Happy Meal. Oh, wow, okay, interesting. So we had some data in Australia of 1,000 young people who were 13 to 17 years old from a low socioeconomic setting, and we had some data around physical activity and happiness. And what we found when we looked at this was sport team members had a 32% higher odds of being happy, and those who were active for at least 4 hours a week or 4 times a week had a 25% higher odds of being happy. Again, cross-sectional data, which direction is this going in? Are happy people more likely to join a sport team or be physically active? Or sport team members or those who are more physically active more likely to be happy? So fortunately, there was some data over in Pelotas in Brazil from a birth cohort study over there. And they had 3,200 young people who had data from when they were 15, which looked at, well, when you're physically active at 15, what are the implications in terms of depression and anxiety when you're 18? So we had this data and we looked at it. And what we actually found that there was no longitudinal association here between physical activity at 15 and what happened in terms of your depression and anxiety at 18. But when we had a look at the happiness side of things, because they'd also measured happiness, we found that there was a positive association. In fact, those who are active at 15, 24% higher odds of being happy at the age of 18. Again, controlling for and adjusting for physical activity levels occurring at 18 years of age and all our other socio-demographic usual suspects. So clearly some different pathways going on here when we're thinking about mental ill-being and well-being outcomes, and they're not the opposite end of some kind of continuum. So what are we doing? What are we missing in physical activity promotion? Coca-Cola are saying 125 years of sharing happiness, not 125 years of reducing anxiety. They're also saying believe in a happier tomorrow, not believe in avoiding depression tomorrow. Yet what are we doing? Where physical activity and mental health messages, being physically active, protects against mental health problems, decreases depression in older adults, reduces the symptoms of postnatal depression, and playing sport reduces psychological distress by this amount. This deficits-focused approach, where are our messages that say be physically active, be happy? So what? So we've got this evidence that tells us physical activity is good for mental well-being if we get it right, if we get the delivery right. It's also pretty clear that there's some kind of virtuous cycle going on here. People who have better mental well-being are more likely to be physically active as well. But if we promote this mental well-being, does it build up some kind of resilience, some kind of mental well-being capital that we can draw upon when we experience perturbations for our psychological health, when stuff goes wrong? And can we draw on that then to prevent mental ill-being? Fortunately, and this is the last study I present today, we had some data, and this was a silver lining from the COVID pandemic. We had some data from Sport New Zealand, which I called the pragmatic cohort study. We collected a heap of information around physical activity participation prior to the pandemic between January 2017 and March 2020. And then we went back to the same individuals who agreed to be recontacted, and we got information from them in the peak of our first lockdown, 3 months later, 3 months after that, and a year after our first lockdown. And what we found was that pre-pandemic physical activity levels were protective of mental health. So our actual pre-pandemic physical activity levels, those who were active prior to the pandemic had a 72% higher odds of having good mental well-being during the first lockdown, irrespective of how much activity they were actually doing during the lockdown. And this was sustained 3 months later, 48% higher odds of having good mental well-being if they were physically active prior to the pandemic. Again, irrespective of how active they were at that time point. And then it appeared to peter out and become not significant. So this idea here that physical activity might build short-term mental health resilience to a crisis. Last take-home message. Physical activity may provide a unique opportunity to take a strengths-based approach to mental well-being and promote psychological resilience to traumatic events. So if we take a look underneath this blanket that we introduced right at the start of the day, we can clearly see there's nuance to the relationship between physical activity and mental health. There's important parts that we need to consider in terms of the context in which it's occurring, the quality of what we're delivering, other ways of knowing and understanding about this, and taking potentially a strengths-based approach to improve the promotion of physical activity for mental health outcomes. Some closing acknowledgements. I always like to call out Michael, a lawyer, and Nita Missy from Uganda and Tonga. Both were absolutely critical to doing any of this research. Michael in particular was someone who I hold dear to my heart and always think about in terms of helping me get on this journey in the first place. The first bit of work, that first graph, never would have happened without him in northern Uganda. Quite an incredible man. I think there's time for a couple of questions. Yeah.
First study in Uganda, did you get a chance to liaise with both Michael Māori model and how much it kind of aligns with the Northern Ugandan cultural context?
No. So that's not something I can. Well, Michael's not online, and so it would be something that I'd have to go and do in person, and it's not something that I've had a chance to do. Yeah. I'd like to though.
I was interested, sorry. I was interested with the last study, did you have any differentiation about the type of physical activity people were doing, whether it was more individualized or social, and whether that could have been like a mediator, and that if you were more involved in team sports, potentially you had more social connections to govern overall?
We haven't looked at that. It's a really good idea, and we can. And if you would like to look at it, the data is available for anyone in this room to have a look at it, but it's a really good idea. We actually haven't published that yet, so it actually might be something that would be of interest to us to look at as part of that. But yeah, good thought. One of the things that we do know that did happen though, and this is tangential to what you're asking, but one of the things that we do know that did happen as a result of the pandemic is that the way in which people are participating in physical activity has changed. And feels is the wrong word. The data that we're seeing tells us that it's probably changed permanently. So we've had a period of time where people were engaging in sport and physical activity in all different ways, and then we had a real shutdown for some types of physical activity. That created opportunities. People were physically active out their front door for the first time for many of them ever, walking in their streets, spiking in their streets. But in terms of getting the sports sector back on its feet in the same way as it was, there doesn't seem to be the same level of interest and the same level of engagement as what was there prior to the pandemic. So that's something that we really need to be thinking about in terms of our future. It comes back to this type and context, our future of physical activity promotion and what people are asking for, particularly if we want to be having mental wellbeing outcomes as a result of it. Sure.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Justin. I mean, from my perspective, I'm asking myself so many more questions than I was before that presentation in a wonderful day, a real journey through what is a very murky and messy landscape, but really being able to question and challenge some of those blanket statements, I think, is a fantastic way of approaching the world that we're living in today. And so I'd next like to pass over to our next presenter, Dr. Appy Talimantonga. And Appy is a general practitioner, and that for us, I think, is a real gift. Often we are